Okay, in this screencast, I'm going to cover an entry-level viewpoint toward how to test and debug a JavaScript application. This is just an overview. You'll be seeing me debug all throughout the quarter and the semester. The reason is because when I code in my screencasts, I tend to make mistakes, which is a great thing. So you'll get to see me debug on the fly. And I am really good at making mistakes. You'll see Chapter 5 labeled here. That's because this PowerPoint is from the first edition. What you really should be looking at is Chapter 4 if you have a newer version of the Mirax, JavaScript, and jQuery. But let's get started on this. The most common syntax errors are going to be misspelled keywords. I've put a reserved words document in this week's lesson plan. It's just called reserved words. If you were to go download it, you see a list of words that are key to JavaScript, keywords, and they cannot be used as variables, and you want to keep them out of your code. Occasionally, we misspell camel-cased methods. Parse integer, for example, is parse int, and we have a tendency to not only call it parse integer, but also not to do the shorthand parse int. So your methods need to be perfectly spelled, and they are case sensitive. I know with Sublime, my text editor, it has pattern matching that will give you an immediate error if you misspell your method. If you omit required parentheses, quotation marks, or braces, you'll get an error. It's very common to have a syntax error where you open up something and you don't close it. The next point brings that to fruition here, not using the same opening and closing quotation mark. If I open a string with a double quote, I need to close it with a double quote. Closing it in a single quote will not work. Omitting the semicolon at the end of the statement won't throw an error. However, if you have multiple statements on one line, as I spoke about in week 1, you need to put a semicolon in front of the first. It's also bad practice. Using one equal sign instead of two when testing for equality or comparison will not throw an error at all. It will simply assign the two values being compared to each other. Lastly, one of the most common syntax errors is misspelling or incorrectly capitalizing an identifier. For example, if you had a variable name sales tax with a camel casing, and you later refer to it in small case, it won't throw an error, but you'll get an undefined on that variable when you test it. So we want to make sure that we get into common practices. If we like camel casing, we stick with it. If it's your code, as long as you're comfortable with what you're doing, you'll be okay. So a differentiation between testing and debugging. The goal of testing is to find all errors before the application is put into production. Debugging occurs during the development process, and it means that we have to fix all errors before the application is put. We want to fix those errors before it's put in production. So testing tends to be more of an umbrella where we go out of our way to try to find errors. And during this quarter, we'll be doing several methods when we get to advanced testing and debugging. Right now, we just want to show you what's the most common errors are, how to use the console, and how to console.log and alert values to see what they are. Also, a big part is using the type of method, which we used a lot last week. So there are 3 common test phases. And when we do a JavaScript application, there's always a user interface, because this is a web language. So the first type of testing is when we check that user interface to make sure the forms work correctly. If we have a form that has illogical input types, for example, if checkboxes are selected for a question that's asking an either or, where it should be radio buttons, that would be a problem. So we need to test the application and its user interface. We need to test it with valid input data to make sure the results are correct. Often when you enter numbers into a form, they'll enter the JavaScript function as a string. We need to make sure we use that parse int and parse float when necessary to make sure all calculations are performed on numbers. Lastly, we need to test the application with invalid data or unexpected user actions. Copying and pasting code into a form is an example of that. We try everything we can to make sure that we're being thorough when we test. If you have motivation to make your application fail, you're in great shape. Chances are you'll figure it out. Also have multiple people test. So the three types of errors that JavaScript has are syntax errors, where the JavaScript statements somehow are incorrectly typed. We have runtime errors, where the JavaScript code runs and then stops unexpectedly. We also have logic errors, where the JavaScript still runs, but is not logically producing the results we expect. This is a screenshot from your textbook where we discuss the calculate miles per gallon application. If you look in the form field, we have NaN. That stands for not a number. This is the result that happens when we add a string and a number. Some other more common syntax errors are not getting multiple syllable methods correctly spelled. I do this constantly. For example, getElementById does not have capital ID at the end. Again, omitting required parentheses, quotation marks, or braces. Misspelling or incorrectly capitalizing identifier, like defining a variable named sales tax that's camel case and referring to it as small case sales tax. There's also problems with HTML that will affect our JavaScript. If we have bad HTML and we try to access an element and that element doesn't have a closing tag, we might not be able to access that element with JavaScript. For example, if we had an ID calling sales tax with a capital T, which we're used to with variable names, and the HTML itself is not consistent with our JavaScript variable names. So let's say the ID is sales_tax. Then there would be a mismatch and we would not be able to access that ID and its values. The biggest thing you'll have to do, especially in this week's homework, is to test to make sure the user entry is the right data type before you process it. If you're expecting a number, run a test using the isNaN method. Make sure it's a number. If it is not, use parseInt or parseFloat to convert that user entry into a numeric value. Also be careful when you're using conditions with double equals. Always make sure that you don't use a single equal sign. When you have floating point numbers or decimals, they can lead to mathematical results that are imprecise. For example, if we were to take 74.95 and multiply it by 0.1, we would get a float that has numerous digits at the end. An important way to fix this problem is to round the result and convert it back to the floating point number. We can do this with .toFixed method. In this case, we're using toFixed to 2 digits. That's what the numeral 2 in the parentheses means. So if we do that, the result would be 750 as a string. But if we parseFloat that value, it'll come back as a number. So it's very common to see parseFloat and then the number .toFixed2 in order to format properly and perform math on something. Remember this when you're doing this week's homework. When you don't declare variables consistently, you can have many problems arise. For example, if you assign a variable with a value that has not yet been declared, JavaScript will treat it as a global variable. And this can happen when you misspell a variable name. For example, if I have sales tax misspelled, the fact is that sales tax is going to be global and sales tax with a capital T is local. So what happens here is that the sales tax is never rounded. Only sales tax is with a small case. This is a very important point. Know whether you're doing something locally or globally. Again, all this means is pertaining to variable scope, where a variable has value. Here we have a function that is ported into a variable called calculate tax, and inside that function we have the sales with a capital T. So that equals whatever subtotal and tax rate gets sent to it. However, we're not going to round sales tax if we port it into sales tax. The return here needs to be called sales small case tax. That's why.